Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first part of the session referencing music in the 21st century, encyclopedias of the past, present, and future. For those who don't know me, let me just briefly introduce myself. Some actually of you might know me as a professor at Columbia University. Some of you might know me as a published author and editor of several volumes on Jewish music. The heart of my work is at RILM, where I've been working for over a decade as editor and most recently as product development coordinator. And I've done so with great pride and great pleasure. My later part of my productive work at RILM as product development coordinator led to a very fruitful product which will be released in the fall. It is the RILM Music Encyclopedias, available in the fall via EBSCOhost. It's a full-text compilation of 41 seminal titles published from 1775 to 2015, comprising over 8,000 pages. If you want to know more about this product, please come to the RILM session at 2 p.m. in this very room, or visit the RILM table and the EBSCO table in the exhibitions. Since one of the very early music reference works was published in 1768, that was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Dictionario de Música, lexicographers and musicologists have aimed to address the various needs for researchers and those seeking knowledge about music. As such, music reference works are reflective of their time and location and of their editors. To take Rousseau again as an example, his Dictionnaire has been considered radical and traditional at the same time. Radical as he advanced in his philosophy on opera and revealed his rejection of French music traditions. Traditional as he held on to existing categories, music as art, music as science, and music theories that were prevalent in the 18th century. This presence of two distinct strands, or voices, can be best understood as a reflection of the dialogue process in the formation of musical ideas. Today, we bring this dialogue into the 21st century with 7 panelists that have been involved as editors and thinkers in shaping music lexicography in the 20th century. That is Hanns-Werner Heister, editor of Komponisten der Gegenwart, Markus Bandur, managing editor of the Handwörterbuch der musikalischen Terminologie. Next to him sits Harry White, editor of the Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland. Next to him sits Don Randel, who was involved as editor in the 3rd and 4th editions of the Harvard Dictionary of Music. Next to him sits Álvaro Torrente, who is involved in the Diccionario de Música Española e Hispanoamericana. And next to him, Laurenz Lütteken, editor-in-chief of the forthcoming MGG Online. And our only lady on the panel is Anna-Lise Santella, senior editor for music reference at Oxford University Press and Grove Music Online. All these panelists will be available in 2 sessions. Our first 90-minute session, the longue durée of music encyclopedias, myth and realities, will address philosophies of content in encyclopedias throughout the history of music lexicography. I'm inviting now 4 of our panelists for short position statements that will introduce us to central concerns of the session: regional coverage, cultural representation, and the meaning of authority. Just a few words on procedure. All of our panelists are on stage because all of them will be involved in the subsequent discussions. So the short presentations by the panelists will be followed by discussions among the panelists and involving you. Although the 2 sessions are separated between content and technology, this division is virtual rather than real. Should you have questions about technology, feel free to ask already in the first half. If you're curious about content in the second half of our double panel, feel free to ask as well. I began with a few remarks on one of the very early music encyclopedias. Let me now go fast forward and introduce to you the mastermind of an ongoing, hence most recent one, Hanns-Werner Heister, Komponisten der Gegenwart.
Thank you, Tina, for invitation and organization. Perfect, as you see. I begin with a title, Paper is Passionate. Then you can see how is KDG looking. That's one of the, to do the loose leaves in. Okay, historical musicologist Walter Wolfgang Sparrer and I conceived Komponisten der Gegenwart, KDG, in 1992. The encyclopedia appears in print, but it is produced as a loose leaf work, which attests to its status as work in progress. With this comes the possibility of adding, correcting, and renewing more or less continuously. In this way, KDG represents a precursor of real digital encyclopedias with its unique possibilities of adding and altering content. As of 2015, the KDG contains more than 10,000 pages, each holding 3,100 characters. Not less. KDG has entries of approximately 800 composers. That's one of the additional edition. First. In the KDG, the number of pages increases periodically. The real world of contemporary music, the number of composers increases also, but not periodically, but continuously. In addition to the periodical and the continuous addition, the canon affects which composer to choose and how to weigh the length of his entry. KDG does not focus on composers considered canonical by whomever. This so-called canon is in itself a compromise between scientific and popular opinions, between appreciation by the musico-cultural community and by simple quantity of performances, between intrinsic aesthetic values and values determined by different socio-cultural contexts. We aim at reflecting and respecting this canon. No composer of importance is excluded. The only limitations is the availability of authors and authoresses. But following the canon is not the real focus of KDG. The KDG aims to amend and extend the canon to compensate the common and conformist view on contemporary composers and to give attention to the neglected, female, forgotten, or prosecuted composers. This reflects our belief that being prominent or famous is not identical with being an excellent composer. Many remarkable composers are not appropriately represented in encyclopedic works. For example, Armando Gentilucci, Italian composer. One reason is surely his affinity to Italian Communist Party, the context, until 1980. Another, his premature death at only 50 years of age, 1939 to 1989. It is difficult to judge if he is canonical. Anyway, in the 70s in Italy, he was one of the leading composers of his generation after Nono and Bruno Maderna, not at least in the context of socially and politically committed music. His oeuvre represents all genres. Stylistically, he changed in the mid-70s from an idiom based on collage and montage, a musica impura, not purified music, to a music more, which accentuate more cantability and diaphaноusness. Two of his books, An Introduction to Contemporary Music, 1969, and several editions, and an introduction to electroacoustic music, 1972, were and are standard works, at least in Italy. His work as teacher and director of a music school in Reggio Emilia from 1970 until his death had lasting impact. Only see the nice picture. There's a laboratory for young composers made as a Scrabble or this type of montage and collage of letters. But his work is continued. I couldn't find in the internet the real exact date, but it must be after terminus post quem, after 2003. Gentillucci's entry in the KGG will serve now as an example for how we present content. Please have a brief glance at what we call the Grundblatt, basic leaf. It's not only for looking, not for reading. You see many characters at least. That's the recto page, and that's the verso page. Each entry, this Grundblatt, has a basic sheet that provides first basic information. The recto pages presents mainly biographical informations. The verso page, informations mainly on works. With a standard, the prices a composer won are also notated. Both pages together account approximately 6,000 characters. As of June 2015, the KDG has such basic sheets for approximately 8 composers as mentioned. Depending on authors, full articles with encyclopedic essay, musical examples, work catalogue, bibliography, and discography follow, if they follow, and if we gain authors. As it is sometimes difficult to recruit authors, full-length articles are often added years later. Currently, KDG has articles for over 180 composers from different lengths. To find authors for new entries is often difficult. I mentioned it 3 times now. As editors, we depend on proposals by authors, networks, personal connections, and symposia are potential pools for authors. You are invited too. But note that KDG is written and published in German. That is a limitation both for the pool of writers and readers. Some operational information. There's no subsidy for KDG from the publishing house or elsewhere. KDG operates on a small-scale basis without any foundation, university, or institute behind it. The lexicon is thus, to a certain degree, a labor of love, not love, labors lost, run in essence by 2 editors, one of which takes on the time-consuming tasks in a segmented continuum of tasks corresponding with authors, editing, revising, proofreading, and that several times continued. I'm not this worker. Work procedure. Let me provide you with a snapshot of the long, multi-segmented and continuous process of writing, reading, transmitting, formerly by letter in snail mail, today, of course, digitally, which is an advantage, as well as correcting and proving an article by one of our valued contributors. Not the final, but one of the final stages of correction. A very good author, you see, it was necessary to correct. That was written by a typewriter long ago. Now it's a little bit easier, but only a little bit. Final result? Oh, sorry. The final result on the other side. Okay. The KDG, in contrast to many other encyclopedias, is an important reference work because the complete and precise work catalogues. In general, the precision by repeated filtering and verifying of the data is a sign of quality of our lexicon. The information are as reliable as possible. The Italian composer, Gentilucci, is again a case in point. It is not easy, sometimes nearly impossible, to collect reliable facts for seemingly simple data, such as orchestration, premieres, and so on. I do not have all scores of Gentilucci, of course. The publishing house normally offers such information, but the Casa Ricordi, formerly a publishing house of high rank, Verdi, Puccini, and so on, nowadays was sold and resold and doesn't care much for his composers. An archive at Reggio Emilia exists, but is not very organized, at least for foreigners, for the access from abroad via internet. The bibliography on Gentilucci is relatively sparse. Therefore, finding correct and comprehensive data depends on private contacts. I am hoping for help from a former student of Gentilucci, Fabrizio Fanticini, which might help to finish my long-planned entry after this conference. The work for KDG and KDG itself refutes the myth that anything can be found on the internet. KDG is still the ultimate accurate work of reference for many composers. On their own websites, these composers often reference the KDG. The public's appreciation of print media and of esteemed authors, for example, Bandura, still are more respectable than the internet, even if the information stems from the composers themselves. Paper is not only patient, but powerful too. Aside from the value of print media, attempts have been made to digitize the KDG. This has been a difficult endeavor. A CD-ROM edition was expensive and failed because of difficulties with the handling of database and copyright issues. The KDG has been made available digitally on the internet in 2008 via the so-called Munzinger archive. This is a publishing house founded in 1913 and meanwhile a provider of lexical information mainly to persons and countries, based on loose-leaf lexica or CD-ROMs. The Munzinger archive is primarily used by press, radio, TV, political institutions, and libraries, not so private public. Relatively new is access to KDG directly via the website of the publishing house Text und Kritik, Text and Critics, at Munich. The KDG will be also available through the RILM encyclopedia collection from this fall on. The inclusion into RILM's endeavor as being part of a collection of encyclopedias seems promising and forward-looking. The solution of the problem of full-text search and retrieval is not simple, but it's possible. The RILM Encyclopedia collection will solve issues of easy full-text search and cross-referencing. The KDG is not an encyclopedia in the general classical sense, for it contains only entrants of names, no subjects or instruments or terms. It centers on compositions and biographical, aesthetic, and historical contexts. And it is not very interdisciplinary. Also, composers are included to transcend barriers between the art. But the specific content makes KDG a valuable contribution of a meta-encyclopedia. The editors are and were very favorable to an encyclopedic perspective. For in the beginning of KDG, in the beginning of the 1990s, Sparrer and I planned, in addition to the lexicon of composers, a lexicon of concepts and items in contemporary music. Begriffe in der Musik der Gegenwart. A little bit different from and more than terms as in Handwörterbuch der musikalischen Terminologie. Markus Bander will say something. That was the Handwörterbuch is not continued, is finished. But the publisher feared costs and risks, understandable but unfortunate. Therefore, we contribute only and don't make it by ourselves. A future meta-encyclopedia should support the effort and to not produce isolated articles, but facilitate references to other lemmata from atonality to sarsuela. For example, the article on Gentilucci then could and should contain links to the great social, cultural, and musico-educational project Musica Realtà, Music and Reality. A journal with this name survived and has changed publishing houses many times. Or links to Nono, Abbado, Polini, Luigi Pestalozza, a former PG, Partito Comunista Italiano, or links to free atonality, polystylistic, composition, electroacoustic music, utopian ideas in music, to pedagogy and society, to the respective authors of the texts for Gentilucci, from Leopardi to Rilke, from Dante to Melville, and so on. Perhaps even to diseases of composers. Talking about a composer without hearing, or at least the sound bit seems uncomfortable for me. Therefore, as finale, I'm finished, let me provide a short sound example with Armando Gentilucci. That's probably his last composition. You see the date some weeks before his death. That's a digital future too.
Paper is more powerful. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
we spare time and cut, you hear at least this, what I call cantability. It's reduced to one instrument, fiato, a wind instrument, or by strings, but at least a little impression. If the meta-encyclopedia could include such sound files like this, perhaps a little bit longer, then it truly would be the encyclopedia of the future. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harry White. I have the Chair of Music in University College Dublin, and it's a great pleasure to be here in the Juilliard School of Music at this wonderful conference. And I'd like to begin by thanking Tina and her colleagues for having invited me to be part of this, I think, very absorbing and somehow reassuring colloquium on why and what encyclopedias are all about. I was just reflecting on the other two speakers talking about these projects being labors of love, and I thought to myself, you know, it's true. I mean, I think the words never again are written across the heart of anybody who involves himself or herself in a project like this. And I also thought, well, you know, Edmund Hillary's famous reply when asked why he climbed Mount Everest was because it was there. And I think that in the case of many of these projects, the answer would be because it was not there, that it somehow represents a kind of primary motivation in lexicography, musical or otherwise, to map something or to achieve something that is lacking, and that one feels a need and one finds to one's pleasure, I think, on the whole, that that need is widely acknowledged by other people. I'm going to be talking about the Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland, which is something of a David among the Goliaths of MGG and Grove and the other works represented here today. But I hope you'll find what I have to say of some interest with regard to a position statement for our subsequent discussion. The Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland represents the first comprehensive survey of Irish musical experience across recorded history, although its principal span extends from the Middle Ages to the present day. EMIR, which is the abbreviation it quickly acquired, EMIR, we couldn't use EMI for obvious reasons, and EMIR sounds or reads like the name of an Arabian potentate, but it also, in pronounced EMIR, sounds like an Irish princess, which genders the encyclopedia straight away. EMIR addresses several distinct areas of musical practice, including traditional music, art music, church music, popular music, the music trade, printing and publishing, instrument manufacture, as well as the relationship between music, literature, and political culture in Ireland. It also documents Irish musical practice elsewhere, notably in North America and the United Kingdom. Perhaps the most important aspect of EMIR from the general perspective of musical lexicography is its attempt to broaden the base of musical practice as this is conceived in older works of musical reference. In particular, EMIR reflects a sequence of editorial principles sufficiently pliant to address the topography of Irish musical practice, in which there is a pronounced tension between the claims of the composer and the musical work on one side, and the claims of oral and popular culture on the other. Although EMIR represents the apparatus of Irish art music, as in biographical and critical entries on composers, complete with work lists, sources, and so on, it also engages closely with the transmission and dissemination of traditional and popular music. But however comprehensive its address, EMIR implicitly draws attention to the fundamental challenge of musical lexicography in Ireland but also elsewhere, which is to reconcile an apparently insatiable quest for information with the imperative of critical and historical interpretation. In these respects, EMIR speaks not only to music in Ireland, but to the general practice of musical lexicography in the 21st century. The quest for information, as we've already heard this morning, is not to be taken lightly. The empirical retrievals of any work of reference worth the name are its animating impulse and principal motivation. In the introduction to EMIR, I remarked on the challenge of compiling an encyclopedia or dictionary in the long shadow of Wikipedia, not least because Wikipedia itself privileges information far above critical commentary. If anything, it maintains an attitude to commentary which is inherently circumspect, even if this does not protect individual articles from occasionally egregious errors of fact. But the ascendancy of information over interpretation promoted by the sheer phenomenon of Wikipedia does not seem to me to promote in turn an axiomatic equation between fact and value, or at least not in the same way as does a coherent work of reference devoted, for example, to the music of a single country. Lexicography as an expression of Western value systems as old as Rousseau can perhaps be taken for granted in an assembly such as the one in which we find ourselves this morning. But the attempt to engage with and map the musical experience of a nation state is much more recent in terms of ambition, and as far as I'm concerned, was not realized until the publication of the Encyclopedia of Music in Canada in 1981. In making this claim, the editors of that encyclopedia explained that it was about, quote, music in Canada and Canada's musical relations with the rest of the world, unquote. I was a graduate student in Toronto when the Encyclopedia of Music in Canada appeared, and the thought struck me almost as soon as I saw it that a similar ingathering of information about music in Ireland, a very small country but one with a very long history, was overdue. This was not only on account of a general absence of Irish music from other lexica, with the sovereign but partial exception of traditional music, but also because of an abiding indifference to music as an expression of cultural history in Ireland itself. I mention this because in the case of EMIR, the equation between fact and value, or more exactly between musical information and socio-cultural meaning, was circumscribed by a global sense of Irish musical history that amounted to little more than Riverdance, the Chieftains, and U2. This means in turn that the primary motivation for embarking on EMIR was to provide for the first time a detailed topography of Irish musical experience which might widen the notably confined reception history of music in Ireland insofar as this existed at all. To illustrate this, we need to turn to the encyclopedia itself and to a sequence of entries from its second volume, which I more or less selected at random. Please bear with me when I read this list. Between pages 954 and 964 of EMIR, we find the following entries: St. Peter's Church Drogheda, St. Stephen's Singers, Stamps and Currency, Stanford Sir Charles Villars, Stanford John James, Stars of Heaven, Steadfast Band, Stevenson John Andrew, Stuart Louis, Stuart Robert Prescott, Stiff Little Fingers, Stockton's Wing, Stokes Mary, and Storer Elizabeth. Within this seam of headwords, we have a brief account of a church in Drogheda in Northern Ireland, which traces its choral foundation to the 13th century and for which an organ was designed in 1770 by John Snetzler and enlarged in 1884 by William Telford. The reader is directed by small capitals to entries on these organ builders. An entry on the representation of music and musicians in Irish coinage and stamps, which also redirects the reader to several other articles, including one on the harp. An extensive essay on Charles Villars Stanford, perhaps the most significant figure in the history of English and Irish music in the 19th century before Elgar, which assesses his career, his significance in the history of music in Ireland and Britain, and his compositional development, and which includes a detailed catalogue of works and a bibliography. A short entry on Stanford's father, which throws light on the repertory of a gifted amateur singer in Dublin in the mid-19th century. A brief entry on an indie quartet, which was formed in Dublin in 1985 and disappeared from view in 1988. The history of a brass band founded in 1951 in southern County Dublin, whose city centre concerts many people would count as a decisive musical experience. An essay on the composer John Andrew Stevenson, once famous as Thomas Moore's musical collaborator, which includes by far the most detailed catalogue of Stevenson's compositions to appear to date. An entry on the jazz guitarist Louis Stewart, which redirects to several other Irish jazz artists. A biographical and critical study of the organist and composer Robert Prescott Stewart, 1825 to 1894, in the context of amateur and professional music making in Dublin in the second half of the 19th century. A brief entry on a Belfast punk band which based much of its material directly in response to the Northern crisis in the late 1970s. An entry on the traditional group Stockton's Wing, which traces its changes of personnel, musical orientation, and stylistic reliances over 25 years. The biography of a singer associated with Smock Alley Theatre and concert life in Dublin between 1740 and 1760. So there you are. If anybody asks you what's an EMIR, now you know. Composers, punk bands, master organ builders, 18th century women singers, the iconography of Irish music and musicians, a jazz virtuoso, the history of a Dublin brass band. None of this subscribes to the narrow reception history of music in Ireland, but all of it enriches the alphabet of Irish musical experience. This does not mean that EMIR repudiates the proverbially traditional excellences of Irish music or remains aloof from their lustre and prestige. On the contrary, its engagement with traditional music is pervasive. The extensive survey articles on traditional music in EMIR are complemented by hundreds of entries on individual traditional musicians and families of musicians throughout both volumes, to say nothing of its retrieval of the sources and ethnography of the tradition itself. Nor would a reader interested in Irish music as an expression of American popular culture fail to notice how attentive EMIR is to the dance and vocal music of the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. My point is that the plural nature of this record represents a distinct value system. When I describe EMIR, as I did a moment ago, as a work which engages with the alphabet of Irish musical experience, it is in order to distinguish it from other works of musical reference, and from the New Grove in particular. In this enterprise, I need briefly to adduce my own experience as a national advisory editor for Grove, in which I discovered anew the motivation for the project of editing EMIR, not least on account of Stanley Sadie's entirely justifiable preferment of composition as a preeminent category of inclusion, with the result that the presence of Irish composers in the revised edition of Grove was significantly increased. It was much harder to make the case for other categories of Irish musical experience, notably but not exclusively in the domains of church music, popular music, and musical infrastructure, a difficulty that brought home to me the cardinal importance ascribed to the composer and to the musical work in Grove's retrieval of European music, notwithstanding Grove's immense retrieval also of traditional and world musics. This meant in turn that when it came to devising a sequence of headwords for EMIR, a task that preoccupied my subject editors and advisory editors for a period of almost 3 years, there was a striking commitment to the wie es eigentlich gewesen of music in Ireland, how it actually was, not because of an enchantment with mindless empiricism, but because of a determination to emancipate the encyclopedia from the constraints of a reception history inadequate to the record of lived musical experience, in which concepts such as the musical work itself were often peripheral or submerged beneath the claims of a very powerful cultural nationalism. Another way of phrasing this would be to suggest that the topography of Irish musical experience seemed a more urgent and hitherto neglected task in compiling EMIR than the history of music in Ireland, an enterprise almost certain to fail if the materials of that history were not assiduously recovered. Some Irish music lives at large in the world. For many people, the sound of Ireland is its traditional music. But music in Ireland is a very different, if related, matter. 2 examples among many can exemplify this here this morning. Handel's Messiah was written for Dublin in the summer of 1741 and first given there in 1742. Not even the most ardent hibernophile, however, would claim Messiah as Irish music. But, as EMIR explains, its decisive importance for the history of music in Ireland can scarcely be overestimated. By contrast, no dictionary or encyclopedia of music, Irish or otherwise, is likely to overlook John Field's Irish nationality. But in what meaningful sense, musically, culturally, historically, are Field's nocturnes or concertos Irish? This distinction between Irish music and music in Ireland is ultimately, perhaps, a distinction between Irish music as a deeply contested and sometimes divisive phenomenon and the much less divisive but altogether more neglected record of Irish musical experience. It is certainly a distinction which presupposes a sense of history. The importance of this distinction, which, to borrow a phrase from Milena Kuss, belongs more generally to the dynamics of cultural representation, was vital to the project of researching, editing, and publishing EMIR from start to finish. But it is also a distinction, I would suggest, that can underscore the difference between musical topography and musical history, a difference which throws into sharp relief the sometimes conflicting objectives which animate musical lexicography in the first place. Thank you very much.
Good morning. A pleasure to be here and to meet some new colleagues about whom I've known for a long time, face to face. The book about which I want to speak is the one with which I have been involved now for decades, the Harvard Dictionary of Music. The very term dictionary evokes, and certainly in an earlier era, evokes notions of authenticity, impersonality, abstraction, enduring truth, and every one of those terms is now hotly contested. We now, in the age of Wikipedia, suppose that there resides in the public elements of the kind of truth that ought to be included in a reference work. Well, the thing about the Harvard Dictionary of Music is that it goes back in time, now almost 70 years or so. The first two editions of it were produced by Willy Appel, a distinguished German musicologist who came to this country, the reigning medievalist in a certain sense, for a certain period. Well, the minute you recognize that fact about it, you begin to recognize that every reference work of this type has behind it the personality of some author. No matter how hard you try to make it impersonal, abstract, enduring, the fact of the matter is, underneath it, there is the hand of an author, and there are the constraints of the culture, the musical culture of his or her time. So we've heard some remarks about the canon. Well, in the case of this musicological work, it was not so much about the canon of music as understood even within the limits of Western concert music. It was about the canon of acceptable dissertation topics. It reflected the state of musicology of its time. To give you an idea of what that was like in an earlier era, when I edited the Journal of the American Musicological Society in the 70s, fully half of the submissions to that journal were about music from before 1600. And I was often challenged by my friends, Charles Ham in particular, why aren't there more articles about popular music and American music? Well, it was because nobody was writing them to submit them. And I would spend my time at the IMS going around listening to papers, buttonhole people say, how about sending me something about music from after 1600? Well, even a dictionary reflects a culture of that kind. It reflects the state of musicology at a certain point. But then beyond that, it reflects this author who is interested in exploring the boundaries of this particular genre, reflecting personal taste and experience, but also suggesting ways in which the boundaries in our field should be expanded or crossed over. This is a much less surprising notion now than it was back when I undertook to edit the third edition. Now, of course, we all question regularly what are the boundaries, if any, between high and low culture, between popular music and concert music, etc. The intersections are manifold, and yet, at some point, there do need to be some limits. In the case of the Harvard Dictionary of Music, it had a very practical goal from day one, 1,000 pages, period. So what could you include within 1,000 pages? And just as important, what would you be obliged to leave out? When I undertook the project, I started absolutely from scratch. So I carried over virtually nothing from the second edition that Professor Appel had made. This was in part because Charles Rosen had written a review of the second edition in the New York Review of Books, which was marvelously witty and vicious. And it caused me many a nightmare as I worked on it myself. And of course, I thought myself, I could write an equally witty and vicious review of my own dictionary because nobody knew its faults and its gaps better than I did. But the goal was nevertheless to produce something that would be useful to musicians more or less broadly. You would put things in it that you knew people might want to look up, but you would put things in it that you hoped some people might want to look up, that it might draw them in to the culture of their time in ways that they hadn't before. Many practical considerations came to bear. Even some of the simplest things you might expect to be in such a book had become very much more complicated since the second edition had been created. So, for example, performance practice of the classical period. Well, there was a time when one might have had a very easy and simple answer to what's the meaning of andante, but it turned out that, after all, that wasn't so simple, depended on what period music you're talking about. And similarly, the piano, well, people were beginning to play 18th century forte pianos, and so instead of just having an illustration courtesy of Steinway and Sons showing the action of the piano, one was obliged to show what the antecedents of that action were. So many things about the advances of scholarship and performance suggested themselves. Probably the biggest, hardest question was what to do about the relationship between concert music, which had been essentially the subject of previous editions, and popular music of all kinds and world music. In the end, the book continues, I hope, to serve something like its original purposes. That is, it is overwhelmingly a book about canonical Western music, but recognizing that that canon is constantly on the move and expanding, and recognizing that now the intersections between, let's call it concert music and popular music and world music, those intersections are very many in number, and when one comes to speaking about the music of composers of the 20th and 21st century, of course one has to take account of the way in which the materials of music have greatly expanded. Still in all, one has to deal with this 1,000 pages. So though I too am a medievalist by training, found myself leaving out an awful lot of stuff about the Middle Ages. The other thing that motivates such a book, in my experience, has to do not only with my career as a scholar, but also with my career as a teacher. I spent many years in the music department at Cornell University teaching our single largest introductory course with no prerequisites at all. Not, I would say, music appreciation. I called it an introduction to music theory because I insisted you had to learn something about notation if you wanted to know something very much about music. Well, my career had been wrapped up in trying to explain things to people who didn't know anything about them. And that right away distinguishes, I think, the tone of the 2 editions of the dictionary I have made from certainly the predecessors and from many other works. That is, I tried always to put myself in the place of the person who was looking up a term because he or she didn't know about it and needed to have it explained in some clear and consistent way. It was for this reason that I, in the main, avoided asking the leading expert on whatever the term was to write the article for that term. This was a sure way of getting something too long that would arrive too late and would be likely to be unintelligible to anybody who didn't already know all about it. My goal then was a kind of extension work in the world of music, to try to engage readers, make things intelligible to them while nevertheless respecting scholarly standards, to give enough bibliography to help somebody try to learn more if that's what they wanted to do, but simultaneously not to let anything get bogged down in whatever the latest scholarly controversy might happen to be. It is then a practical book, 1,000 pages maximum. When we talk about technology, I may have occasion to say, and I'll say it right now quickly, there's still some utility in a physical book that you can hold in one hand. And if you're sitting at the piano making your way through some piece and there is a term, it really probably is easier to open this book and look up that term than it is to go to your computer, or even if you have your iPad with you, to look it up online. So there is a utility to this, but it is a very practical consideration. As I say, I make no claim that this or any other reference book can be purely abstract, immune from any traces of the author. If you pore over, this is not an invitation, the pages of the 3rd and 4th editions of the Harvard Dictionary, careful reading would reveal that the editor seems to have grown up in Latin America. The editor looks as if he might have been a trumpet player. The editor seemed to like jazz a lot, but was a chant scholar in the bargain, etc. Many traces of the hand of the author remain, despite one's claim that it somehow serves an audience with some sense of authenticity. Let me say finally that this word authenticity is, of course, a fraught term as well. What, or maybe a better term is authoritative. To what degree can something be thought to be authoritative today? And out of what mechanism could you produce something authoritative? My closest encounter with a real struggle over what's authoritative was the period that I served on the advisory board of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the whole life of which was to be the authoritative source of information about more or less anything. And then came Wikipedia, and the poor editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica found themselves challenged to the core. Here, this book that had existed, these volumes that had existed for many years with authors, distinguished people writing the entries on the subjects they knew best, was being challenged by Wikipedia, in which anybody who wanted to write in could write in, and it was thought that you could derive this essential character for articles from a broad public. The poor Encyclopedia Britannica really had, I think, close to a nervous breakdown over all of this. The notion previously that readers should want to write in and tell you something about what was in there was politely accepted, but one wouldn't dream that ordinary readers would have any power to intervene in what was printed there. And yet that was the direction in which things were going, and how Britannica has wrestled with that problem was a very interesting kind of struggle. I make no claim for the Harvard Dictionary of Music on that term. It's a book written by real people, a lot of it written by me, even though I'm not the expert on many of those topics, but written by me in the hope that I have some ability to explain it to real people who don't already know all about it. I wouldn't say that I would never do it again. It was an extremely interesting challenge. Took more years of my life than I expected. It was before the personal computer came along, and yet it was produced on a desktop computer with 8-inch floppy disks. That computer had, get this, 56K of memory, 16-bit memory to be sure, but 56K. And it was about the size of a bread box, had a second disk drive, which was wonderful, and that little machine cost $25,000. Imagine that. Anyway, the dictionary hopes to be a practical thing. Music reference works have been waiting for the present moment in technology, but we have yet to capture them, so alas, here's yet another book in which you can read about what a German augmented sixth chord is, but you don't get to hear it. And you can read what an oboe is, but you haven't the slightest idea what it sounds like. All the technologies available to now ought to be fundamental to any music dictionary. Unfortunately, resource constraints prevent it, and so what it takes to publish a book for ordinary mortals that they can afford to buy prevents a good deal of what ought to be possible, indeed is possible, in reference works of our time. If you don't know the Harvard Dictionary of Music personally, it's fairly heavy and will hold things down in a quite strong wind. Thank you very much.
I want to thank our first 4 panelists and now open the floor to questions, or also the whole panel to questions, if there are some. Well, let me break the ice then. With our now encyclopedias, I wonder what our panelists have to say about the future of encyclopedias. They all have vast experiences in conceiving solid work in the last couple of decades. So how do you see the encyclopedia of the future? And this is a question both for panelists and, of course, for audiences, since you're also involved in screening and reading reference works.
Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I wish I had the chance to have this 13 years ago when I started the project. We published the Encyclopedia of Music in Portugal, on the Portuguese music, the same issue that you raised. Well, starting essentially from scratch, in a country in which musicology and ethnomusicology were very recently completed. So there was scarcity of authors, all of the problems you described were there. Sources are scattered, no information, no other scholarly reference work to start from to correct. So it was a huge challenge, and it took over a decade. And then the contribution of graduate students was absolutely fabulous. So the work was key, and it was a learning experience for all those involved. What I would like to leave for you here, for us to think about and discuss, thinking of the future, is, well, I find that in touching the related areas, that there are genres, musical instruments, processes, terms, that are very much related. I mean, let me give you an example. Fernando, for example, my Spanish colleague will certainly share with me this concern. Is a genre that, well, is shared by Indonesia and also is practiced in Latin America. the Portuguese-speaking or the Spanish-speaking. So thinking of the future, and for those of us who have worked on encyclopedias nationally, I think that we should think more in terms of regional terms, in a more dynamic, from a more dynamic perspective, where several authors can actually work together, sharing the experience and producing an entry which will truly reflect dynamic processes, how genres travel, how musical instruments travel, and how they have been used in different contexts, in different or similar ways. So this is one point. The other, which I'm sure that was brought up partially, but as the Encyclopedia of Music in 20th Century Portugal, which is published in Portuguese, which is a handicap, unfortunately, because only Portuguese and native Spanish readers can read it. As we proceeded, there was more and more information in the internet, in Wikipedia, and we noticed that some of our texts, after the Wikipedia was published, were copied. They even appeared in some of the blogs of musicians. So how does one deal with this kind of issue? And finally, more dialogic editing. I mean, what do you think about working with the composers themselves who are alive, composers, performers, and so forth? We made an experiment, and we did some dialogic editing with composers and performers, but it is, of course, it has its own problems, because what we do and the way the author analyzes and wishes to evaluate the work might be different from the agenda of the composer or performer. So all of these are, I think, issues that concern me.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Does any of the panelists want to respond to this? Well, maybe I can start speaking for Hanns-Werner Heister. I think he's actually, he's in dialogue with some composers, and I thought, you know, maybe he can respond to the latest issue you brought up.
Of course, but it's valid only for living composers, because encyclopedias have to deal with history too. Of course, I knew some many composers personally. Some, not many, were friends or are friends. Gentilucci was not a friend, but I liked him. That is necessary because for living composers, because you don't get exact informations always. That's simply for lexicographical information, you need the personal contacts. It's a tendency, I'm not sure, but it might be a tendency which reinforces your opinion, that composers don't use publishing houses, because if they don't do anything, why should they give up copyrights and so on? And they make their own websites and their own distribution. It's valid. I know it, for example, from Latin American composers, which are poor, mainly the nations are not rich, and they do and they use the internet, the possibilities of the internet, for distributing their scores for free, more or less, but nobody would buy them. That is it okay an answer? I could dilagate, but it's perhaps it would be too long.
This is a wonderful panel. Thank you very much. I very much miss my mentor, Stanley Sadie, who I think belongs up there with you. I worked for many years on the New Grove Dictionary. I was one of the senior commissioning editors for what is now Grove Online for 20th century composers. So I worked with Stanley in putting together the editorial staff for the group that became the very large I think in answer to your question, and I will actually, I don't know if you remember, we had many wonderful lunches. Wonderful lunches with Harry White, discussing exactly what you talked about, which were the restraints and how, you know, that was really important actually. But we'll have to talk about that later. But my point is the economics behind putting together a very large dictionary or an encyclopedia in the 20th century in the light of Wikipedia and in the light of how people research today. So my students, they don't, I mean, I teach them about growth, but when it comes down to it, they are very reluctant to use the dictionaries and the incredible scholarship that you all represent. And even though we teach them, because a lot of the material is borrowed and is elsewhere on the internet, and we talk about critical assessment of scholarship using things that are signed, you know, talking, but the point is that the way that people are researching information, the way people are going to information, the general public is not using the dictionaries or encyclopedias in the way that they did. So what publisher, when I think of the immense outlay that at that time Macmillan and the various publishers that bought Grove since put out, or that MKJ it has put into that dictionary for so many years, how can that economic model be sustained in the future? And so I think that's really an important, that was one of the things I came to the session to hear, because it's something that having lived it and having worked on as we worked on putting the coding into Grove in order to make it so it had an electronic future, we couldn't foresee all of the completely different ways that people would be actually accessing information and how that would just take the bottom out of the economics. So I open that up. The question is that.
Representative here. This is something obviously we think about a lot, and I think that one of the key areas that we need to explore, and I'll be talking more about this a little later, is the way in which we network with other publications. We know from our usage stats that our most viewed articles, and I think my marketing director is down there, she can probably back me up on this, most of our most viewed articles are coming from Wikipedia, and we have a relationship with Wikipedia where we provide them some access to Grove so that they're getting good facts and that they're referencing us, and it helps people find Grove. Our current platform is also sort of limiting in this regard because we are completely behind a paywall at the moment. I'll talk more about this later too, but we are in the process of designing a new platform which will give us more flexibility in terms of the content we are able to make freely available. And so that's part of the process too. But you can't ignore Wikipedia, and it definitely does have a financial impact. So considering how to help students use it to find information that we trust and that we know has been treated carefully is probably the way to go, rather than to pretend that it's not there.